You are designing the folder structure for an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 container for Gotham Technologies, a company that handles large volumes of data across various departments, R&D, sales, and customer support. Users will query this data using a variety of services, including Azure Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics serverless SQL pools. The data needs to be secured by department, and most queries will involve data from the current year or current month. Which folder structure should you recommend to support fast queries and simplified folder security? You are designing an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool for Umbrella Corp, a company that needs to manage employee records efficiently. The system must fulfill the following requirements. Can return an employee record from a given point in time. The system should support retrieving employee information as it was at a specific date. Maintains the latest employee information. It should also keep and provide access to the most current employee records. Minimizes query complexity. The design should ensure that queries are straightforward and efficient. How should you model the employee data? You have an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 container that holds 100 terabytes of data for Metropolis Enterprises, a company that needs to ensure data availability in case of an outage. You want to make sure that the data remains available for read operations in a secondary region if the primary region experiences an outage. Additionally, you want to minimize costs. Which type of data redundancy should you use? You are planning to implement an Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage account for Stark Industries, a company that needs to ensure its data lake remains available even if a data center fails in the primary Azure region. To meet this requirement while minimizing costs, which type of replication should you choose? You are managing an Azure storage account for Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, which contains 100 gigabytes of files. These files include text and numerical data, with 75% of the rows consisting of description data averaging 1.1 megabytes in length. You plan to copy this data to an Azure Synapse Analytics Enterprise Data Warehouse. To ensure a quick and efficient data transfer, you need to prepare the files appropriately. Solution: you convert the files to compressed, delimited text files. Does this solution meet the goal? You are managing a data warehouse in Azure Synapse Analytics, dedicated SQL pool for Starfleet Command. The Starship Operations team frequently writes complex select queries with multiple join and case statements to prepare data for daily inventory reports. These reports use various where parameters depending on the specific needs. To ensure that the dataset for these reports is readily available and to minimize query times, what should you implement? You are working with an Azure Synapse Analytics workspace named WS1 that includes an Apache Spark pool named Pool1. You plan to create a database named DB1 in Pool1. To ensure that tables created in DB1 are automatically available as external tables in the built-in serverless SQL pool, which format should you use for the tables in DB1? You are planning to implement an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 container for Gotham City Police Department, which will store CSV files. The file sizes will vary based on the number of events occurring per hour, ranging from 4 kilobytes to 5 gigabytes. To ensure that these files are optimized for batch processing, what should you do? You are designing a financial transactions table in an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool for Gotham Bank. The table will have a clustered column store index and include the following columns. Transaction type, 40 million rows per transaction type. Customer segment, 4 million rows per customer segment. Transaction month, 65 million rows per month. Account type, 500 million rows per account type. The query requirements are as follows. Analysts will most commonly analyze transactions for a given month. Transaction analysis will typically summarize transactions by transaction type, customer segment, and/or account type. You need to recommend a partition strategy for the table to minimize query times. On which column should you recommend partitioning the table? You plan to ingest streaming social media data using Azure Stream Analytics. The data will be stored in files in Azure Data Lake Storage and then consumed by Azure Databricks and Polybase in Azure Synapse Analytics. To ensure that queries from Databricks and Polybase encounter the fewest possible errors, and that the files can be queried quickly while retaining data type information, which data output format should you recommend? At Stark Industries' Data Operations Department, you are setting up a batch dataset in the Parquet format. The data files will be created using Azure Data Factory and stored in Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. These files will be accessed by an Azure Synapse Analytics serverless SQL pool for generating reports. To ensure that you minimize storage costs for this setup, what should you do? At Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, you are tasked with designing a dimension table for a data warehouse in the Department of Magical Records. This table will track various attributes of magical creatures over time and needs to preserve historical data by adding new rows whenever the attributes change. Which type of slowly changing dimension, SCD, should you use to achieve this? At Wayne Enterprises, you have an Apache Spark pool named Pool 1 in Azure Synapse Analytics. You need to load various JSON files from an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 container into tables within Pool 1. The JSON files have different structures and data types. To ensure that the data types from the source are maintained, what approach should you use? At Stark Industries, you have an Azure Databricks workspace named Workspace 1 in the standard pricing tier. It contains an all-purpose cluster named Cluster 1. You want to reduce the time it takes for Cluster 1 to start and scale up, while also minimizing costs. What should you do first? At Wayne Enterprises, you have an Azure subscription that includes an Azure Blob Storage account named Storage One and an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool named Pool One. You need to store data in Storage One to be read by Pool One. The solution must enable Pool One to skip unnecessary columns and rows, automatically create column statistics, and minimize file size. Which type of file should you use? At Stark Industries, you manage an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool that contains a table named Table 1. Table 1 has the following characteristics: 1 billion rows, a clustered column store index, a hash-distributed column named Product Key, a non-nullable column named Sales Date of the Date data type. Each month, 30 million rows will be added to Table 1. You need to partition Table 1 based on the sales date column to optimize query performance and data loading. How often should you create a partition? In Wayland-Yutani Corporation, you have an Azure Databricks workspace with a Delta Lake dimension table named Table 1. This table is designed as a Type 2 slowly changing dimension (SCD) table. You need to apply updates from a source table to Table 1. Which Apache Spark SQL operation should you use to accomplish this? In the Shire's Data Analytics department, you are designing an Azure Data Lake storage solution to transform raw JSON files for an analytical workload. You need to recommend a format for the transformed files. The solution must contain information about the data types of each column in the files, support querying a subset of columns in the files, support read-heavy analytical workloads, minimize the file size. Which format should you recommend? In Gotham Enterprises Data Management Department, you have an Azure storage account that contains 100 gigabytes of files. These files consist of text and numerical values, with 75% of the rows containing description data averaging 1.1 megabytes in size. You plan to transfer this data to an enterprise data warehouse in Azure Synapse Analytics. To ensure that the data copies quickly, you need to prepare the files accordingly. Solution: you modify the files to ensure that each row is less than 1 megabyte. Does this meet the goal? In Hogwarts Data Department, you plan to create a dimension table in Azure Synapse Analytics that will be less than 1 gigabyte in size. The table is intended to be used for various analytical queries. You need to configure the table to meet the following criteria. Provide the fastest query time. Minimize data movement during queries. Which type of table should you use? You are designing a dimension table for the Starfleet database in an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool. To ensure the fastest query performance, you need to create a surrogate key for the table. What should you use for the surrogate key? You are designing the folder structure for an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account for the Intergalactic Research Institute. The data will be queried by using Azure Synapse Analytics serverless SQL pools and serverless Apache Spark pools. Most queries will include a filter on the current year or week, and data will be secured by data source. You need to recommend a folder structure that meets the following requirements. Supports the usage patterns. Simplifies folder security. Minimizes query times. Which folder structure should you recommend? You have an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool named Pool 1 at Stark Industries. Pool 1 contains a table named Table 1. After loading 5 terabytes of data into Table 1, you need to ensure that column store compression is maximized for the table. Which statement should you execute? You have an Azure subscription at Wayland-Yutani Corporation that contains an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account named Account 1 and an Azure Synapse Analytics workspace named Workspace 1. You need to create an external table in a serverless SQL pool in Workspace 1. The external table will reference CSV files stored in Account 1. The solution must maximize performance. How should you configure the external table? You have an Azure Databricks workspace at OCP Technologies and an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account named Storage 1. New files are uploaded daily to Storage 1. You need to recommend a solution that configures Storage 1 as a structured streaming source. The solution must meet the following requirements. Incrementally process new files as they are uploaded to Storage 1. Minimize implementation and maintenance effort. Minimize the cost of processing millions of files. Support schema inference and schema drift. Which should you include in the recommendation? You have an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool at Cosmic Enterprises. You plan to create a fact table named Table 1 that will contain a clustered column store index. You need to optimize data compression and query performance for Table 1. What is the minimum number of rows that Table 1 should contain before you create partitions? You have an Azure Synapse Analytics workspace named WS1 that contains an Apache Spark pool named Pool 1. You plan to create a database named DB1 in Pool 1. You need to ensure that when tables are created in DB1, they are automatically available as external tables to the built-in serverless SQL pool. Which format should you use for the tables in DB1? You have an Azure Data Factory pipeline named Pipeline 1. You need to execute Pipeline 1 at 2 a.m. every day. The solution must ensure that if the trigger for Pipeline 1 stops, the next pipeline execution will occur at 2 a.m. following a restart of the trigger. Which type of trigger should you create? You manage an enterprise data warehouse in Azure Synapse Analytics. Users report slow performance when they run commonly used queries, but no issues are reported for infrequently used queries. You need to monitor resource utilization to determine the source of the performance issues. Which metric should you monitor? You have an Azure Synapse Analytics workspace that contains an Apache Spark pool named Spark Pool 1. Spark Pool 1 contains a Delta Lake table named Spark Table 1. You need to recommend a solution that supports Transact SQL queries against the data referenced by Spark Table 1. The solution must ensure that the queries can use partition elimination. What should you include in the recommendation? At the fictional company Stark Industries, the data engineering team is working on a complex data pipeline within Azure Data Factory, ADF1. While working on the pipeline, they discover that the Save button is disabled and they are facing validation errors that prevent them from publishing the pipeline. To ensure that they can save the logic of the pipeline, what should the team do? At the fictional company Wayne Enterprises, the data engineering team is working on a complex data pipeline within Azure Data Factory, ADF1. They find that the Save button is unavailable and they encounter validation errors preventing them from publishing the pipeline. To ensure they can save the pipeline's logic, should the team export ADF1 as an Azure Resource Manager, ARM, template? At the fictional company Stark Industries, the data operations team is working with Azure Data Factory, ADF1. They have built a complex data pipeline in ADF1, but they encounter a situation where the Save button is unavailable due to validation errors that prevent publishing. To ensure they can save the logic of the pipeline, should they disable all the triggers for ADF1? At Stark Industries, you need to automate a process in Azure Data Factory, ADF, so that a pipeline is triggered whenever a new file arrives in an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 container. To achieve this, which resource provider should you enable? At Wayne Enterprises, you plan to perform batch processing in Azure Databricks on a daily basis. To optimize your batch jobs, which type of Databricks cluster should you use? At Stark Industries, you have an Azure Data Factory instance with two pipelines, named Pipeline 1 and Pipeline 2. Pipeline 1 contains a series of activities, including a try-catch block. Pipeline 2 includes activities that trigger Pipeline 1. You execute Pipeline 2, but stored procedure 1 within Pipeline 1 fails. What will be the status of the pipeline runs? At the Ministry of Magic, you manage an Azure Data Factory with 10 pipelines, each serving a specific purpose: ingestion, transformation, or loading. You need to label each pipeline according to its main function to facilitate grouping and filtering in the monitoring experience within Data Factory. What should you add to each pipeline to achieve this? At the Stark Industries research facility, you need to design a solution for performing statistical analysis using custom proprietary Python functions on near real-time data streaming from Azure Event Hubs. To ensure minimal latency, which Azure service should you recommend for this purpose? You are designing an Azure Databricks cluster for the prestigious Stark Industries, where the data analytics team needs to handle user-defined local processes. You must recommend a cluster configuration that will minimize query latency for high-performance computing, support the maximum number of users running queries concurrently, keep costs in check without compromising performance. Given these requirements, which cluster type should you recommend? You are working on an Azure Data Factory pipeline for the renowned Dunder Mifflin Paper Company, which performs incremental data loads to an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account. The data is identified by a column named Last Updated Date in the source table, and you plan to run the pipeline every 4 hours. To meet the following requirements: automatically retry the execution if the pipeline run fails due to concurrency or throttling limits. Support backfilling existing data in the table. Which type of trigger should you use? You are managing data for the fictional Stark Industries, which uses an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool containing a table named Table 1. The company stores files in an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 container named Container 1. You need to insert data from these files into Table 1, transforming the data as needed. Additionally, you want to ensure that each time data files are loaded into Container 1, the date time is included as an extra column in Table 1. To achieve this, you plan to use an Azure Synapse Analytics pipeline. You decide to use a data flow that includes a derived column transformation. Does this approach meet the goal? At Wayne Enterprises, you tasked with designing an Azure Data Factory pipeline that includes a mapping data flow. The pipeline needs to handle JSON data where objects contain nested arrays. Your goal is to transform this JSON data into a tabular dataset, where each item in the arrays is represented as a separate row. Which transformation method should you use in the mapping data flow to achieve this? At Stark Industries, you have an Azure Data Factory pipeline named Pipeline 1. This pipeline includes a copy activity that is configured to send data to an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account. Pipeline 1 is triggered by a schedule trigger. You recently changed the copy activity destination to a new storage account and merged this change into the collaboration branch. However, after the scheduled pipeline execution, you found that the data was not copied to the new storage account. What is the next step you should take to ensure the data is correctly copied to the new storage account? At Stark Industries, you are tasked with setting up an Azure Databricks workspace with a tiered structure to handle 3 different types of workloads. Data engineers who will use Python and SQL. Jobs that will run notebooks using Python, Scala, and SQL. Data scientists performing ad hoc analysis with Scala and R. The enterprise architecture team has established the following standards. Data engineers must share a cluster. The job cluster should be managed through a request process for deploying packaged notebooks. Each data scientist must have their own cluster that automatically terminates after 120 minutes of inactivity. Currently, there are 3 data scientists. You decide to create a standard cluster for each data scientist, a high concurrency cluster for the data engineers, a standard cluster for the jobs. Does this setup meet the requirements? At Stark Industries, you have an Azure Data Factory version 2, v2, resource named DF1, which includes a linked service. You also have an Azure Key Vault named Vault1, containing an encryption key named Key1. You need to encrypt DF1 using Key1. What should you do first to accomplish this? At Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, you have an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account named ADLS2, which is secured by a virtual network. You are designing a SQL pool in Azure Synapse Analytics that will utilize ADLS2 as a data source. To ensure secure and seamless access, which authentication method should you use? At Hogwarts IT Department, you are developing an application that needs to access data stored in Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. To grant permissions to a specific application for a limited time period, which solution should you recommend? At Stark Industries, you've created an Azure Databricks cluster and specified an additional library to install. However, when you attempt to load this library into a notebook, it is not found. To diagnose this issue, what should you review? At Gotham City Analytics, you are managing a SQL pool in Azure Synapse. You notice that some queries are either failing or experiencing significant delays. To diagnose if there are any transactions that have been rolled back, which dynamic management view should you query?